After 10 years, I found the letters. The drawer stuck the way drawers do after years of use, soft resistance, then a give. My fingers brushed against envelopes that smelled faintly of old perfume and dust, thin as the underside of a sleeping thing. For a moment I thought they were bills, unopened invitations, some stray receipts that had slid behind the stacks of legal pads in his study. Then I saw the handwriting, loops that belonged to him, the slope that matched the notes he'd once tucked into my lunchbox when we were newly married and reckless about small private affection. But these envelopes had never been given to me. They were folded and sealed, hidden beneath a ledger, tied with a ribbon that had faded where light had never touched it. I remember the way my chest tightened, like a hand closing around my heart. Memory and suspicion braided into one movement. 10 years of mornings in late offices, dinners eaten individually scattered across the kitchen like small apologies. The way his laughter had grown scarce. 10 years condensed into the curl of blue ink on old paper. I slit the first envelope with the edge of a nail and began to read. The words on the page were clear enough, and yet I could not place them. They were intimate, urgent, but addressed to no name I recognized. There were references, places, shorthand, dates that felt private, like a map with whole sections erased. In those opening lines, I heard the echo of every sleepless night I had spent trying to understand him. Every late meeting, every weekend at the office, every time I had swallowed a question. I read until the paper blurred. For 3 days I lived with that letter pressed to my chest like an accusation. I did what people do when the floor beneath them shifts. I gathered evidence. I retraced his steps, I pulled his calendars, and I hovered near his phone until his back was a familiar landscape of secrets. I asked myself the question that wanted to break me. Had I been married to a stranger all these years? This is how things begin or end, with one mistaken assumption that finds momentum in the small mercies of other people's mouths. After the first letter, the rest unfurled like a bloody ribbon. There were 10 of them? No, 12, maybe more. My counting became a ritual I performed to feel control. Each envelope contained lines that made sense in only the most terrible of ways. There were nicknames, allusions to private jokes, an urgency in the tone that made my skin crawl. He wrote about meetings and flights. He apologized for missing anniversaries. He sketched plans that sounded like futures that never took place. There were pages that stopped mid-sentence, as if interrupted. There were dates, some recent, some from years ago, references to names I did not know, to places that might be hotels or apartment numbers. I did not know what to do with the certainty that burned like acid. I wanted to ask, to demand and to show him the letters and watch the lie fold, but that was my mistake from the first. I read the paper as a verdict before I had heard his voice in response. 10 years of cohabitation, and I chose the page over his eyes. When I finally put the envelopes down on the dining table, he was at the sink, rinsing a glass. He turned when I called his name. He smiled the way he smiled when he was exhausted but still kind. It made the letters feel like an unsheathed knife. "This isn't yours," I said, and he looked at the table, then at me. I remember how the house seemed suddenly too loud, the tick of the clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator. He reached for a towel and said, "What is this?" "You tell me," I said. "They were in your drawer." He didn't pick one up. He searched my face as if there were something blinding there. "You shouldn't be going through my things." There are words that become accusations depending on the tone. His sentence landed like one of those, calm to the point of coldness. But I had already decided the story. I let the letter speak for him. The confrontation was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was a sliding scale of indignities that piled on each other. I remember the glare of the overhead light, the way the glass on the table reflected my own face in a split, accusatory way. His defenses were quicksilver, changes of subject, denials with the practiced patience of a man who had argued in court for years. He told me they were drafts, that he had written to himself sometimes to organize thoughts, that people wrote in strange ways when they were tired, that maybe I had misunderstood. His voice hardened only when I mentioned a name I had pieced together from a clue, Lou. He bristled as if at a word that opened an infected wound. "You think I've been cheating on you?" he said. "After 10 years? With someone like that?" His face made the idea obscene to him. But my humiliation had already metastasized into accusation, and those who witnessed my anger accepted it like a kind of proof. We had been married 10 years. The early years appeared now in a series of warm flashes in my memory. The city apartment with the peeling paint where we had danced in the kitchen to an album we could both recite by heart. The late-night confessions over cheap wine, the small notes he used to hide. There was a time when secrets were soft things, late-night confessions, small surprises. But the work that had made him famous at the firm also made him distant. He became a different kind of light in our house, functional, efficient, necessary for survival. He was a senior lawyer at one of the city's most respected firms, a man who could tilt a room with his opinion. His presence in courtrooms and boardrooms knitted him into the city's social fabric. His absence at home, when he was late for dinners or away on what he called depositions, festered into a landscape I did not recognize. We had kept a home that looked whole from the outside. Friends assumed we were a steady couple. Neighbors spoke of loyalty when we passed them on walks. But behind closed doors, we had a language of small betrayals. Chores not done, a forgotten birthday here, a forgotten name for a child's classmate there. Those absences did not cause suspicion by themselves, but when threaded together with hidden envelopes, they became proof. The first person I called was my sister-in-law. Maybe that was another mistake. I confided in her the way desperate people do, urgently, with the full weight of evidence though not yet a case. She came over and we sat at the kitchen table with the letters spread like evidence in a trial. She read them slowly. When she looked up, the kindness that used to live on her face had twisted into something cruel. "You can't let this ruin your life," she said. "You know how things are in our circles. If this gets out, it will destroy more than you think." Her words were not meant to comfort. They were the blueprints for a strategy. The family, which had always measured status like currency, smelled an opportunity. My in-laws were not people to be trifled with. They had cultivated relationships like harvestable crops, and a scandal could be seeded into a harvest of favors. Within days, gossip, thin and sharp as winter air, began to wind through the firm and into the social fabric of our acquaintances. It traveled by whispered phone calls, by eyes at cocktail parties, by the casual cruelty of those who like to watch others stumble. At work, things changed quickly. Association partners I had known only as silhouettes behind glass doors began to look at me with the relief of those who believe they could never be the object of scandal themselves. One of his junior associates, a man whose promotion had been delayed twice and who I had once defended to my husband in a drunken outburst, smiled at me like he had never smiled before. The rumor acted like a solvent. Connections dissolved, alliances rearranged. Promotion lists that had been whispered about in corners surfaced with subtle shifts. His expected elevation to senior partner, the culmination of his decade in practice, was all but announced to him in private, and then suspended in the space of one rumor. The senior partner, Mr. Chu, whose steadiness was a kind of weather for the firm, called an emergency meeting. He asked questions in a way that suggested he was not merely probing the facts, but testing loyalties. "You know how fragile reputations are," he said to a room that smelled faintly of cold coffee. "We can't afford distractions." His words were a judicial gavel. They did not accuse my husband explicitly. They only suggested that the firm needed a leader who could be beyond reproach. Those closest to power, who had always wanted to displace him, moved with a precision I had seen before in boardrooms, but never in my own kitchen. Petty colleagues presented themselves as loyalists, their late allegiance sharpened by the chance to fill a vacuum. Office politics is not a battlefield. It's a minefield where one misstep costs status. It wasn't long before someone leaked to a journalist with the right appetite for social scandal. An article appeared with the usual coyness of tabloid-influenced writing, references to rumored indiscretions, a line about mysterious correspondence, and a photograph of our house taken from a distance. There was no mention of names, but the implication was there, and people are cruelly talented at connecting two and two and making a narrative that suits them. The rumor machine loved a hole and would gladly fill it with fiction. My in-laws had an agenda. In private, they presented me with an ultimatum, something that still makes me feel cold when I replay their words. "If you sign the papers quietly, you keep your dignity and the child's security," my father-in-law said, as if he were negotiating a real estate deal. "If you make this public, you will ruin us both." He did not say us, as in our marriage. He said it as if the family reputation were a ledger to be balanced and my actions were expenses. There are ways to weaponize gossip, and they are often simple. Threaten a promotion, suggest instability, call in favors. My husband's sibling stepped forward, not all at once, but with coordinated urgency. Chen Mingyu, a brother who had always been interested in power, told me in a text that my choices would affect inheritance and future opportunities. Chen Jianshan implied that protests in the boardroom could make my husband's position untenable. They painted my reaction as a social hazard, and the firm, the hive of social capital, began to buzz with the impending collapse of one of its brightest. I was not naive to the way families operate. Before I had met him, I had watched his parents cultivate an image of respectability and achievement like a garden, but I had not expected them to use me as a tool. Their control was exercised with surgical indifference. Either I would be forced into silence or ejected. They told me, in the privacy of the study where portraits watched like witnesses, that my display of anger had endangered them. They spoke of loyalty and decorum, of the quiet remedies that preserve the temple. I felt smaller than I had in years. The legal process, when it arrived, was clinical and merciless. The first time a lawyer sat across from me with a blue folder, the room felt like a courthouse in miniature. He explained what the firm could do to limit fallout. He explained custody in terms that assumed I'd be a presence but not a primary decision maker. He explained settlements with a tone that suggested he was offering a kindness, but everything in the handshake felt like a negotiation in which my bargaining chips were not just money, but reputation and the right to speak. I think the hardest part was how quickly my life reframed itself into small demands. Sign here, agree there, do not speak to the press. The first set of divorce papers arrived like an envelope that contained both an end and a threat. The terms proposed by my husband, mediated by the family, were kinder than they could have been, but there was a condition: silence. A confidentiality agreement, the lawyer called it, with penalties that made my stomach drop. Sign and the story would be contained. Refuse and the consequences, they hinted, would be unending. There were nights when I thought about burning the letters. It seemed clean, decisive, a purging of the thing that had started the ruin. But even burning would not undo the cascade. Gossip had already leapt from mouth to mouth. Alliances had already shifted. The law firm was a creature of momentum, the sort of place where rumor is currency and suspicion becomes policy. Without proof, there was little that could be done. With proof, there was also little else. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal family dinner, where I had been quietly lectured about the cost of losing face, I walked back into the study and opened the envelopes again. The room was sun-washed in a way that made everything soft at the edges. I read with a more patient mind, the way one might examine an old photograph with magnification. There were moments that bent my certainty. Certain phrases read differently in a slower light. References that sounded illicit in the rush of anger were domestic in context. A line about the apartment on Harrow could be what I thought it was, or an old office he had used when he was first establishing a satellite practice. The nicknames could be code for colleagues or clients. The urgency might have been for career decisions rather than romantic meetings. My head began to swim with alternatives, but every alternative felt like cowardice. An excuse for me to stay? I took the letters to a woman I used to know in law school. Small world connections that feel orchestrated when you need them. She worked in forensics now, a kind person with a fondness for solving puzzles. She read a few lines and then asked to keep a copy. Handwriting can tell a story, she said. But context is the storyteller. She was the first to politely suggest that the letters might not be what I feared. She said there were ways to check, dates of stationery, postal marks, pen flow, but none of that would cure the wound I had given myself by choosing to believe. While I tried to decide what to do, the firm's quiet machinations accelerated. The partner vote that had been scheduled to consider his promotion was moved forward without much fanfare. Meetings that used to take months now compressed into days. I went into the office one morning to pick up a file and felt everyone look at me as if I were a page in a gossip column. The assistant at the front desk, a woman who had once offered me sympathy over a coffee, refused to meet my eyes. Papers were filed, opinions were voiced in back channels. I heard, through a friend who owed me one, that Mr. Chu was hedging. To protect the firm from fallout, he had asked for a delay in any formal announcement, but also for an internal audit of leadership. The message was clear. Reputation first, people second. I learned later that the rival woman, Liu Royan, the name I had whispered in that first fevered confrontation, was more complicated than the caricature of other woman. In the way these things go, she appeared as a shadow initially, a snippet of a social media photo, a line in a message I did not see directly but heard of secondhand. Rumors attached themselves to her like barnacles. Some colleagues said she was a client, others that she was part of a charitable committee. Still others insisted she had once worked at the firm as a contract paralegal. She did not appear at the gatherings where accusations were hammered out, and when I sought her out for answers, she looked at me with frank bewilderment. She cut her hair short, and she said simply, "I don't know why my name is in everyone's mouth." When the divorce papers were officially filed, the public nature of our unspooling became concrete. The notebooks with our children's daycare receipts were opened and examined. Questions about income were raised. Financial disclosures were prepared. The family home was evaluated. Everyone at the firm seemed to pivot to a new posture of careful neutrality. People smiled with their mouths and withdrew with their eyes. Even those who had once been kind had motives now. The economy of our social life converted into a ledger. Who benefited if he fell? Who lost status if we were seen as unstable? Debt collectors called late one night. That is when the practical consequences landed. My husband had always been our household's financial engine. I had been the one to manage the daily flow, but he signed the bigger checks. With the firm's internal turbulence and the threat of losing clients, our accounts became sensitive. Lines of credit that had once been comfortable became tight. We received notices, small, then larger, about obligations that needed attention. The shelf of financial security that had been built over 10 years showed finger-sized cracks when pressure was applied. Facing the possibility of losing everything, I did what anyone would do. I tried to make a plan. I called a lawyer of my own, a woman who had run small custody cases and understood the bleak arithmetic of settlements. She told me the truth. Marital assets would be divided, but if I were seen as the one who had started the trouble, I might be asked to accept a less favorable settlement in exchange for silence. "It happens all the time," she said, and I hated her for pointing out that the machinery of divorce was efficient in grinding the vulnerable down. In the middle of all this, Mr. G appeared like a fissure in the landscape. I had met him twice before, once at a fundraiser and once at a mutual friend's wedding. He had the quiet gravity of someone who had learned to read the room and choose his battles carefully. He worked in a different circle, in finance rather than law, and his name invoked a measure of influence. He sent a message, brief and pragmatic. "If you need counsel, call me. I owe your husband a favor, one I don't plan to call in at his expense." His words were a lifeline and a warning braided together. I did not know yet whether to trust him. Offers of help in moments like these often come with strings invisible until later. But the truth is that when someone threatens the basic things of your life, custody, stability, the reputation you had built, you listen for any possible support. The letters lay on my desk like a map I could not read. I began slowly to doubt my own interpretation. The fear I had held so tightly loosened into something like curiosity. If 10 years could have been a misreading, then maybe the rush to judgment had been my undoing. If I had leaned away from him rather than toward understanding, then who was to blame but me for not asking the right question at the right time? The idea that I might have broken the thing I loved with my own impatience was more crushing than any betrayal could have been. Yet confession is not a unilateral thing. Even as I began to imagine other readings of the letters, I had to contend with the way the world was already operating on the certainty that I had chosen. People had taken sides, reputations had been nudged, promotion calendars had been rearranged, families had already moved to manage their risk. The machinery we had unleashed would not be mollified easily. At night, I would lie awake and try to remember the man I had married, the way he had carried our infant daughter into the living room at 3 in the morning because she had been crying. The way he had once left his briefcase by the door so he could play with the blocks. I tried to reconcile those images with the man who did not get home for dinners and whose drawer held unsent intimacies. Somewhere between those versions of him, there was a story I had not yet been willing to hear. The possibility that he had been protecting someone, or something, or even me, in a way that did not translate to gestures I could see. That possibility felt like treason to my initial certainty. It felt like a betrayal of my righteous indignation. but it also felt like the only thing that might save us from total collapse. When I walked into the firm again, the office felt colder than any winter I had known. Mr. Chu met me in his private office with the formality of someone who keeps the books of human mistakes. He spoke in hypotheticals at first: reputational risk, client confidence, leadership accountability, but the subtext was clear. "We are not in the business of spectacle," he said. "We are in the business of law. Please understand, Ms. Lin, that the firm must take steps to ensure it can continue to represent its clients without distraction." He did not say he was asking my husband to step back, but that was the implication. He offered, almost kindly, to appoint an interim leader to stabilize practice groups. He said this like a man marking time before a transition. There was nothing in his demeanor that suggested malice. Rather, there was an efficiency that made me feel as if I were a problem to be solved. That afternoon, my husband's phone buzzed with messages I could not read. For the first time in a decade, I saw fear in his face. He had always been good at hiding it. He told me finally that he had no idea how the letters ended up where they did. He said there were things he had not told me: small sacrifices, financial decisions made to protect certain clients, a few professional risks he had taken in private that were now coming home to roost. He did not give me names I could use. He did not explain the nicknames. He only said, with a kind of removed sorrow, "I didn't want to make you complicit in some of these arrangements." Complicity, protection, secrets as armor. His words made sense in the abstract, but were unsatisfying in practice. The problem with secrets is that they are a one-way shelter. They protect the teller and encourage the kept in dark to fashion narratives out of silence. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, a courier arrived with a packet of documents: a motion for temporary custody, proposed financial disclosure, and a draft of a confidentiality agreement. The firm was efficient, as always. The papers bore the imprint of someone who had built a career on his ability to contain chaos. The heartbeat of our 10-year marriage was now codified into legal clauses. This is where the story in my head paused, a hinge that had not yet decided which way it would swing. There were people assembling on both sides, moves being made with the deliberation one reserves for chess. Allies and adversaries aligned in shadowed rooms, and the next move was about to be played. I gathered the letters into a single stack and put them back into the drawer where I had found them. The ribbon was dustier now, as if time had finally accepted their existence. I closed the drawer slowly, not because I wanted to hide them, but because for the first time I wanted to think before I acted. 10 years had taught me that the impulsive thing often felt righteous, and that righteous often breeds ruin. If you want to see how this ends, stay until the last scene. I left the drawer closed for a week and pretended I hadn't seen what I had. That act of pretending felt like breathing underwater, necessary but dizzying. The house hummed on. Our daughter still demanded pancakes, laundry, homework. The ordinary made a rude and stubborn bed that I could not leave. I moved through it like a woman carrying a secret heat that might burn through the seams. Mr. G called the day after I sent a terse message asking for help. He suggested a place that felt neutral, a quiet cafe downtown where the light did not expose much and people gave their attention to plates instead of private disasters. He arrived in a coat that suited the climate, measured, without flourish. He listened without interrupting when I told him, line by line, the story I had narrated to Sanity. "When things like this happen," he said finally, "they amplify what was already true in the room. They don't create it." It was the same thing I had been telling myself, and hearing it from someone who did not owe me sympathy was a small, important relief. He did not offer to fix everything. He said he had contacts, old classmates, people who could make discreet inquiries. "If there's proof that can clear this, I'd rather it be found without spectacle," he said. "If there's proof of betrayal, you deserve to know that too. Either way, don't let the rumor mill set the terms." I put the letters back into an envelope and entrusted them to the forensics friend from law school, Mara, who smelled faintly of lemon and old books, and who treated handwriting like archaeology. Mara took her time. She put the letters under a lamp, traced strokes with an index finger, and photographed details obsessively, then sent them to a colleague who specialized in paper and ink. Days later, she called me with careful optimism. "They're his handwriting," she said. "Without a doubt. The slant, the pressure points, it's him, but there's more." she explained in that softened professional cadence that some of the pages were not letters sent to anyone at all. They were drafts. Some were unsent notes. The envelopes had been sealed by hand, but there were no postmarks or postage markers that indicated they had ever left the house. A handful contained dates that matched anniversaries, small homebound events, and, most importantly, one contained a reference so precise that she asked me to stop breathing for a moment. "There's a line here about the night you danced in the kitchen with the peeling paint," she said. "He mentions the album you both knew by heart. No one else could have written that line except someone who shared that night with you." My hands found their way to my mouth. The thought that these pages might be love letters to me did something to the heady fever of accusation. But Mara was cautious. "It could be that he wrote to himself to hold on to those memories," she said. "People do that. It might have been a private ritual, but the handwriting is his, and the references are ours." When I told Mr. G, he did not look surprised. He only nodded and then asked the question that had been gnawing at me. Why hide them? Why stash love letters in a drawer for 10 years and never, ever give them to the woman they were about? "I think he was afraid," Mara offered when I brought the possibility to her later. "Men like him, circumspect, public-facing, sometimes build walls around tenderness because they fear the vulnerability will be used. Maybe he thought he'd protect you by keeping it private. Maybe he thought his showing it would embarrass or endanger you. We can speculate, but the point is, there are ways to show love that do not look like betrayal. He chose one of them." Speculation was a scaffold that barely held up under my shaking hands, but it offered a path. If the letters were for me, then my reading of code and absence had been a misread. If they were for me, then I had accused him of something his heart had not done in words. A new, colder pain set in, the knowledge that I might have opened a door that could not be closed simply by apology. Meanwhile, the firm stormed on. Mr. Chu did not call me back with confession or contrition. He called with procedure. There was a formal meeting scheduled to discuss leadership. There were whispers of client reassignment. The rumor had metastasized into organizational action, and official notices began to appear, as if to confirm that the world outside my kitchen mirrored the one inside. Mr. G suggested a parallel strategy: slow the firm long enough for evidence to be considered and for the story to be reframed before gossip hardened into irreversible decisions. He used a connection at a financial publication to draw attention to the fact that haste could ruin careers and that rumors demanded care. The article that appeared did not name names. It was a meditative piece about how quickly reputations are reshaped by rumor and how institutions must protect due process. It was careful, and its subtext gave Mr. Chu pause. Within the firm, conversations lengthened. Votes that had felt like foregone conclusions began to stall. At the same time, I realized I had to step into the arena I had avoided. Avoidance had been comfortable, because to look was to act, and action would force consequences. I called my husband's office and asked to see the calendar entries for the months referenced in the letters. He balked initially at sharing anything, from principle, from pride, from the instinct to keep parts of his life unexamined. But law, unlike intimacy, thrives on records. He handed me copies of itineraries, flights, client meetings, hotel bookings. Some of the notations were cryptic, codes for clients, shorthand he had used for years. Others were plainly domestic, surrendered days off, shifted schedules to cover our daughter's recital. There were gaps I could not explain, and not everything in the letters aligned perfectly with the paper trail. That made my head swim with the possibility that both versions could be true at once, that he loved me and yet had reason to keep things hidden. The family, however, did not wait for nuance. They moved with the speed of people protecting an asset. My father-in-law proposed a structured settlement: keep quiet, accept a reasonable financial arrangement, secure custody terms that would look good to others. "This is not about truth," he said at another cold dinner where portraits observed dispassionately. "It's about containment." His eyes were not unkind. They were pragmatic, but his pragmatism made me into an instrument to be tuned. I wrestled for days with the decision to sign. If I signed, I'd keep a measure of privacy and safety. If I didn't, they promised, as if in theater, that my daughter's life and the family's reputation would be on the line. The negotiation felt less like a legal process and more like a war of attrition. The family had resources. They were practiced at bending narratives. One morning, in the overflow of a small bleak sleep, my phone buzzed with a message from Lou Royan. She had read a public piece about rumored correspondence and had, contrary to gossip, reached out privately. "I don't know how my name got dragged into this," she wrote, "but I want you to know I have nothing to hide. If it helps, meet me. There are things I can show you. Letters of my own, records that will put some of this to rest." It felt strange to accept evidence from a woman I'd once thought of as a shadow. I met her in a florist's shop, near a window where old sunlight made the stems glow. She was not the figure I had conjured in the fever of accusation. She was a woman with a civic job, with a small garden in the city, who told me with calm intensity that her name had been attached to the rumor because she had sat on a charitable board with my husband once, years ago, and because she had been in contact about a pro bono client. "You are not the first woman to be named because it makes for a better story," she said. "But that doesn't mean you are not the center of the pain." Her voice was clear, and carried with it the kind of testimony that does not rely on dramatic gestures. She handed me in exchange an email thread between herself and my husband from 3 years earlier, about a community event. There was nothing romantic in it. There was, however, a pattern of my husband's life reaching into corners I had not seen. The edges of truth were not clean, they were corroded by secrecy, and by the reflexes of people in power to protect certain things by leaving others in the dark. The real turning point came unexpectedly. Mara's colleague, who had tested the ink and paper, found a detail that changed the tone of everything. One of the drafts contained a postscript, a shorthand nickname that matched the diminutive my mother had used for me as a child, a name my husband had used only once at our son's first birthday when he was laughing and tipsy and tender. It was a small domestic thing. It was also unassailable. "You asked whether he wrote these to himself," Mara said when we met again, and she sounded relieved as if a weight had been lifted. "He didn't. These were meant for you." I felt something unspool in my chest, relief knotted with shame. The letters were his love letters, hidden because he did not trust the world to hold his tenderness without breaking it for him. The fury that had made me act was still there, but its fuel had changed. I was angry that he had chosen to be opaque, angry that our intimacy had drifted into code instead of conversation, angry that habit and pride had built a wall between us. The next day I invited my husband to sit with me in the living room. The air was anemic. The house felt like a room in which two people had lacquered over truths for years. I did not begin with accusation. I began with the letter Mara had identified, one I had read in the frenzy and then placed back like an ember. I had rewritten the letter, copying the postscript my father-in-law would have torn out, putting the nickname in the exact place Mara had found it. "I found these," I said. "I read them. I thought—" My voice broke on the simple word. "I thought you were cheating." He looked at me in a way that had nothing to do with courtrooms. No performance, no argument. There was only a man who had been seen and then unseen. He let out a long breath, and then, in a voice that did not pretend to be untroubled, he said, "I should have told you. I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me from what?" I demanded. "From a rumor? From humiliation? From the way they might use tenderness?" The questions were small and large and came out like stones. He answered in fragments. He had been given cases, he said, that required a kind of discretion I did not understand. There were clients whose lives were fragile and whose exposure would ruin more than the litigants. At the beginning, he told me, he wrote to me as a way to keep the memory of home amid a life that demanded him. He had hidden letters because the men he worked with saw sentiment as a vulnerability. He had been afraid the letters, if discovered, would be weaponized against me as they were now weaponized. "You could have told me," I said, not able to keep the ache out of my voice. 10 years, and you kept a drawer between us?" "I thought I was keeping us safe," he said. "I see now that I was keeping us apart." His apology was a small thing in the middle of the damage. It did not erase the legal motions, the family haggling, the nights of fear. It did not fix my own part in the cascade. It did, however, open a door that had not been open in months. The next hours were a torrent. Conversation, confessions, bits of truth that had been boxed for too long. He told me, haltingly, about specific cases that required confidentiality. He could not name clients or cases. He refused to risk others to save himself. But he let me see why he had been secretive. Not because he wished to betray me, but because he had believed secrecy could protect more than it destroyed. I could see the error in that logic and also understand its intent. We fell asleep that night on the same sofa, exhausted, our daughter dreaming peacefully in the next room. There was no conclusion, only the beginning of another less certain conversation. Confronting the family was harder than sitting with him. They had been architects of containment, and to ask them to undo what they had set in motion was to ask them to admit fallibility. I could not demand anything of them. I could only present evidence and speak honestly about the mistake I had made. That was both cowardly and brave. It depends on the day. At the family meeting, arranged by my father-in-law in the same wood-paneled study where they had lectured me, there were faces that had been my allies and enemies in variations. I placed Mara's report, the forensic analysis, the email from Liu Royan, and copies of the letters on the table, and then told the room the truth in short, even sentences. I made a mistake, I said. I read what I wanted to read. I acted on a conclusion instead of asking. He wrote those letters to me. I did not look at the truth until it was almost too late. Silence unrolled like cloth. You could feel the muscles in their faces shift. My mother-in-law's eyes flickered. My father-in-law's jaw tightened. My sister-in-law, who had once offered strategies in the soft light of the kitchen, folded her hands and said nothing. Chen Mingyu's face, always quick to judge, showed something like recalculation. What does this change? My father-in-law asked finally. He was not being cruel, he was being practical, but the question was also a blade. It asked me to detail the limits of my own mistake. It changes that what I accused him of was not what happened, I said. It changes that you weaponized my pain and did not ask who you were protecting. It changes that we have to consider how we let rumors govern decisions. They offered a variety of responses. Chen Jianshan muttered about how everyone was damaged by public spectacle. My sister-in-law recommended quiet settlements. Mr. Chu wrote a line in an email to the firm that expressed regret for hasty moves and asked for patience in re-evaluating leadership decisions. It was not a dramatic unmasking. It was the slow, grinding work of institutions recalibrating when confronted with inconvenient facts. There were costs. Mr. Chu did not publicly unravel his initial decisions. He simply pushed for a more deliberative process and opened an internal review. The siblings, Mingyu and Jianshan, found their alliances shifted. Some of their social advantages dimmed as whispers about their handling of the situation spread. Nothing catastrophic happened to them. Families are rarely theatrical enough for catastrophic justice, but a social ledger rebalanced, favors were withheld, invitations tightened, and, most painfully for them, they lost the easy opportunism that had lubricated their rise. For me, the price was more intimate. I had to apologize publicly to colleagues who had been dragged into an ill-begotten scandal, to friends who had been asked to choose sides, and to my husband in a way that did not absolve him nor minimize my part in the chaos. I had to meet my daughter's teachers and speak simply. Our family had made missteps, we were fixing them. I signed adjusted agreements at the family's insistence to secure financial stability for my daughter. But for the first time, I refused to sign a clause that would prevent me from speaking about the truth if the family attempted to weaponize it again. It was a small point of agency, and they grumbled, but it was mine. The last legal step was perhaps the most humbling. The firm did not immediately restore my husband to a path of unquestioned advancement. A vote of confidence in leadership required client certainty. Not everyone was willing to wait through the murk of rumor. The partners' meeting concluded with a compromise. My husband would step back from a public leadership role for a probationary period, receive counseling, and present himself for a peer review in 6 months. It was not sweeping redemption, but it was a start. Mr. Chu called me privately and admitted that his initial move had been brisk. He said he regretted the damage to private lives and would work to make the firm's processes less reflexively defensive. The question of whether to rebuild or to leave folded in around me like a map with 2 routes. Rebuilding meant a long, uneven road. Therapy, renegotiation, demonstrations of change. Leaving meant a different kind of courage. To take financial independence, to guard my child's security, to build a life not defined by the shadow of false accusation. Both demanded sacrifice, both demanded acceptance. My husband and I sat in the subdued light of our kitchen and spoke about it in terms that had once felt impossible. Concrete plans, transparent schedules, a pact to tell the truth earlier than would be comfortable. The choice, when it came, felt less like revelation and more like excavation, layer by layer of truth and shame and intention. The first possibility unfolded when he asked me, in a voice that wanted to be careful and clear, if I would consider trying. "I will be less secretive," he promised. "I will ask for help. I will go to therapy. I will not hide letters anymore." It was a list of behaviors, not a vow that could guarantee feeling. We set conditions: counseling, a shared account for household decisions, monthly conversations where we laid out our calendars and feelings. We drew a map of what accountability would look like. The second possibility was quieter, gentler in its urgency. "If you choose to leave," he said in a different conversation, "I will not make it harder. I created this by not telling you. If that's your path, I will help you make it sustainable." He meant it in the way that broken men sometimes do. Earnest, careful, and aware of their culpability. I weighed both options like a coin in a palm. Each had its risks and potential for healing. I will give you both endings now, because the truth of the story is not that one path is right for everyone. It is that truth asks us to be honest about our actions and their consequences, and then to choose with eyes open. Ending A. Reconciliation forged slowly. We chose, cautiously, to try. The decision was not a leap of faith. It was a series of small yeses and many pauses. We began therapy together and separately. In sessions, I spoke about the loneliness I had felt and how that loneliness had made me read subtext as destiny. He spoke about fear, the fear of letting tenderness be used against the people he cared about. Therapy named patterns and suggested modest rituals. A weekly truth hour where we would share fears. A rule that no major decision would be made in silence. A promise to put words on things before silence could warp them. He stepped back from pursuing promotion aggressively. The firm assigned an interim leader and promised to reevaluate only after my husband had demonstrated consistent transparency and leadership that could withstand scrutiny. It was a bitter compromise for a man used to moving rooms with his presence, but he agreed to it not as punishment, but as penance and practical work. He attended counseling for the ways secrecy had been a protective, destructive habit. I allowed myself to read the letters again, this time with him across from me. We read them aloud, haltingly, and then laughed in the private, relieved way that people sometimes do when something heavy has been put down. The words, once turnstiles of pain, became small monuments to a younger tenderness he had feared to offer. My in-laws receded in the ways families do when they find their control slipping. They offered apologies that were more perfunctory than heartfelt, but they did make small reparations. Public statements were adjusted, invitations extended again, and certain social punishments were withdrawn. Chen Mingyu, in particular, lost a measure of favor he had banked on. People outside our household simply stopped offering him the benefit of the doubt as eagerly. 6 months later, there was a morning I remember because it was simple. Our daughter woke, and my husband had made sugar-free pancakes for her. He had remembered to pack a lunch. He kissed me on the forehead, in a way that contained the small attentions he had once hidden in notes. We had not healed. We were learning to be less secretive. The firm had not restored him automatically, but a client who had once wavered called to say she appreciated his honesty in a conversation that had been painstakingly arranged. The world had not rearranged itself, but the small things, shared calendars, rituals of openness, the reading of old letters out loud, had retuned the instrument. We both knew the risk. Trust could be rebuilt and then lost again, but rebuilding was not the same as returning to what we had before. We were making room for tenderness that admitted fear. The final scene of this path. I take one of the letters, one that had begun with a clumsy apology and ended with a small domestic promise, and I slide it into my handbag as I go to work. It is not a relic of a mistake. It is evidence that we chose to try. The letters were no longer a verdict. They were invitations. Ending B. Independence, dignity without reconciliation. I chose instead to leave. The decision did not feel like defeat. It felt like an answer to a question I had been afraid to ask myself. I kept custody of our daughter, with an arrangement that allowed for shared parenting, but positioned me as the primary caregiver because stability mattered more than formality. The settlement was reasonable, secured by the family's willingness to avoid later spectacle, and I insisted finally on my right to speak if the family attempted further weaponization. My refusal to sign complete confidentiality irritated them, but it was my line of dignity. Mr. G helped me find a job that valued the skills I had let drift into the background during our marriage. It started as consulting work, small projects that paid and offered time flexibility. I found an apartment that overlooked a small park. I kept one letter, the one with the postscript that Mara had found. I kept it not as bait for reconciliation but as a reminder of what love had looked like, not ruined, not absent, but hidden. The first months were awkward. There were delicates to manage, moving a school schedule, answering family calls with a new formality, facing the looks of acquaintances who had once assumed things about me. But there was also a fierce tenderness in small independence, my daughter learning to ride a bike in the park, the quiet between tasks where I could breathe, the way I learned to budget and to love the rhythms of a life I had chosen to reclaim. The siblings' maneuvers had reputational consequences. They found themselves less welcome in certain circles. Mr. Chu instituted a review of how the firm handled rumors. A small but significant bureaucratic step that meant the next family might not be used as an instrument so easily. My husband, freed from the need to pretend everything was hidden for protection, sought help for his compulsive secrecy. We spoke sometimes about practical matters and co-parenting. In private, there was no bitterness in me, only a pragmatic desire to build a life that did not require the permission of the family or the firm to be intact. 6 months later, I stood outside our daughter's school, watching her run into arms of friends, and felt a quiet that was not the absence of worry, but the fullness of a day. I took the letter from my bag and read the line Mara had pointed out. It made me ache, but not in the angry way it had once made me erupt. It was an ache that recognized both love and error in the same motion. I folded the paper and placed it in a box with a handful of other small things that had marked our life. A ticket stub from an early trip, a child's first drawing. They were not relics of a marriage to be resurrected, but artifacts of a life I had lived and from which I had learned. Epilogue for each ending. Reconciliation. Image, a quiet morning, the three of us, our daughter between us, sipping tea. My husband reads a letter aloud, voice slightly tremulous. We all laugh at the memory. Trust is not complete. It is being made. Independence image. A new apartment window, the city moving below. My daughter draws at the table, humming. I sip coffee and write an email for a client. In a drawer, the box of letters waits. I close it, not to bury the past, but to keep it with care. Which ending is truer? Both. Real lives are rarely tidy. The core lesson, the thing that will stay with me longer than any courtroom motion or family dinner, is simple. I reached for a verdict on paper before I asked a person for their truth. That rush to certainty cost me dearly. It cost me the steadiness of friends, the faith of colleagues, and nights I will never get back. It also, oddly, taught me how desperately I wanted to be understood. So if there is a single thing I can offer someone listening to this story, it is this. When the thing that looks like proof lands on your lap, breathe. You can be furious and still ask. You can be hurt and still choose to hold your anger to the light and look at it carefully. Evidence is not always what it first appears to be. And sometimes, in the hollow left by our own rushes to judgment, we find the real work, to face our own part honestly, and then to choose, with humility, what we will do about it. If this story moved you, share your own I was wrong moment in the comments, and subscribe for more true-to-life dramas.